Harold Bennett was 72, a retired history teacher from a small town in Oregon. For most of his life, he prided himself on keeping things simple, tending his garden, reading in the afternoons, and enjoying long walks with his wife, Ellen. But over the past year, something began to change. His knees ached more than usual, his morning walks felt shorter, and there were days when just getting out of bed seemed harder than it should. He brushed it off at first, thinking it was just age catching up with him. But deep down, a quiet worry began to grow. The turning point came one Saturday morning. Harold was preparing his favorite breakfast, a bowl of yogurt with fruit and a sprinkle of seeds, the same way he had for years. But halfway through, he felt a strange heaviness in his chest and an unusual swelling around his ankles. Ellen insisted they visit their doctor that afternoon. The tests didn't show anything alarming at first glance, but the doctor, a longtime friend of mine, leaned in and said softly, "Harold, some of the foods you think are helping you might actually be making things worse." Those words hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. As I sat across from Harold in my clinic, I could see the mix of confusion and frustration in his eyes. This was a man who had always believed in healthy eating, fresh produce, nuts, and seeds. How could seeds, of all things, be a problem, he asked me. And I understood his disbelief. After all, we've been told for decades that seeds are nature's little health capsules, packed with fiber and nutrients. But the truth, especially for someone in their 70s, is more complicated than the simple labels suggest. I explained that some seeds, while nutritious in certain contexts, can quietly fuel inflammation, upset the delicate balance of fats in the body, and even block the absorption of vital minerals. In people over 60, whose bodies process and recover more slowly, these effects aren't always obvious at first. They creep in silently, a little more stiffness in the knees, a bit more fatigue after a short walk, swelling that lingers longer than it should. For Harold, these signs had been quietly building for months, hidden under the guise of a healthy routine. Over the next few weeks, we made small but deliberate changes to Harold's diet. We removed the seeds that were tipping his body into imbalance and replaced them with others that nourished and repaired. It wasn't magic, and it didn't happen overnight, but slowly his energy returned. The swelling faded. His morning walk stretched longer, and the sparkle in his eyes, the one that had been dulled by constant fatigue, began to return. He told me one morning, with a smile I hadn't seen in months, "I feel like my body is listening to me again." If you're over 60, Harold's story might sound familiar. The foods you've trusted for years may not be serving you the same way they used to. Your body has changed, and it needs a different kind of care now, one that respects where you are in life. Today, I want to share with you the very same guidance I gave Harold, some seeds you may want to stop touching altogether, and others you might consider making a daily ritual. And by the end of this journey, you might just discover, like Harold did, that small, thoughtful choices can open the door to a stronger, lighter, and more vibrant you. The winter rains had settled over Oregon, and Harold found himself staring out the kitchen window more often these days. The once brisk walks through the neighborhood had turned into hesitant steps around the living room. Ellen noticed it too, how he lingered in his chair after breakfast, rubbing his knees as though trying to coax life back into them. The morning light, which used to pull him outdoors, now only revealed the stiffness in his movements. He would tell her, "Just a bit tired today," but the truth was, he couldn't quite remember the last time he felt truly light on his feet. It wasn't that Harold had let himself go. In fact, he was proud of his daily routine. A bowl of yogurt topped with blueberries and a generous sprinkle of sunflower seeds, sometimes chia, depending on what was in the pantry. Friends at the community center always said he was the picture of a healthy retiree. But inside, Harold was beginning to feel as though something unseen was draining his strength. By late afternoon, even simple tasks, trimming a few branches in the garden, tidying up the shed, felt like they took twice as much effort as they should. One evening, Ellen found him sitting on the edge of the bed, pressing his thumbs into the swollen skin above his ankles. "It's nothing serious," he tried to reassure her, though the unease in his voice betrayed him. She reminded him of his doctor's words from a few months ago, that some foods could be quietly working against him. Harold had nodded politely back then, certain his diet was beyond reproach. Now, he wasn't so sure. The seeds he ate daily, the ones he thought were strengthening his body, had never been questioned. Why would they? Seeds were superfoods after all. The turning point came one damp Tuesday morning. Harold was halfway through his breakfast when a dull ache settled into his chest. It wasn't sharp enough to alarm him, but it was enough to make him set his spoon down. He sat quietly, waiting for it to pass, but instead noticed his fingers were tingling, a sensation that spread like pins and needles through both hands. Ellen insisted they go to the clinic, and by mid-morning, we were sitting together in my office. I had known Harold for years, and I could see he was troubled. He wasn't the type to make a fuss. I asked him to walk me through his day, meal by meal. As he spoke, I began to see a familiar pattern: sunflower seeds in his breakfast, trail mix with sesame and chia during his afternoon reading, even seed crackers with cheese before dinner. It wasn't the occasional handful that worried me, but the daily rhythm, the constant load of certain fats and compounds his body now struggled to manage. I explained as gently as I could that sunflower seeds, for example, were flooding his system with omega-6 fats, far beyond what his body could balance with omega-3s. That imbalance was like a quiet fire smoldering in his joints and blood vessels. Harold frowned, leaning back in the chair. "So you're telling me I've been making myself worse with breakfast?" His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and resignation. I could understand. It's never easy to realize that something you've trusted for years, something you thought was protecting you, could actually be part of the problem. I told him about another patient, Margaret, who had almost the exact same story. A healthy seed habit, persistent swelling, unexplained fatigue. She had improved dramatically once we made a few key changes. Over the next week, Harold agreed to ease back on the sunflower seeds and replace them with pumpkin seeds. Lightly roasted, unsalted, eaten slowly. Ellen took it as a personal mission, preparing a small jar of them each morning and leaving it by his reading chair. At first, he missed the familiar crunch of his old breakfast topping, but within 10 days, he noticed something surprising. The swelling in his ankles began to fade. His afternoon slump wasn't as heavy. One morning, without thinking, he found himself walking past the end of his street before realizing he'd gone farther than he had in weeks. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental to Harold. In that moment, he understood something most people overlook. Change doesn't have to be drastic to be powerful. Sometimes it's as simple as knowing which doors to close and which to open. For him, closing the door on sunflower seeds wasn't about giving up a snack. It was about reclaiming the quiet strength in his mornings, the lightness in his steps, the simple joy of walking without thinking about his knees. By early spring, Harold's walks had lengthened again, the swelling in his ankles mostly gone. Ellen would watch him from the porch, her coffee steaming in her hands, and smile at the way he stopped to greet neighbors along the way. But there was still something troubling him. Even with the improvements, a deep fatigue clung to certain days, the kind where his legs felt heavy before noon and his mind felt wrapped in cotton. He brushed it off as old bones, but Ellen, ever observant, suspected there was more to it. One rainy afternoon, she was unpacking groceries when she called me, almost as if she'd uncovered a family secret. "You need to look at this," she said, holding up a half-empty bottle of light salad dressing Harold had been using for years. On the label, clear as day, were the words, cottonseed oil, one of the cheapest and most common oils used in packaged foods. She'd never paid it much attention. Why would she? It was hidden behind other words like heart healthy and made with natural oils, but I knew what it meant. When Harold came in for his next appointment, I placed the bottle on my desk between us. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. He squinted at the label, confused. "It's just salad dressing, low fat. I've been using it since Ellen went on her cholesterol kick." I leaned in. "It's more than that, Harold. Cottonseed oil isn't like olive oil or even canola. It contains something called gossypol, a natural toxin that plants make to fight off insects. Works great for bugs, but inside the human body, especially yours, it's a different story." He chuckled softly, as if I were exaggerating. "A toxin? In my salad?" But as I explained how gossypol interferes with heart rhythm, blocks calcium from feeding his muscles, and adds to the oxidative stress that already comes with age, I watched his face change. "So you're saying this could be why I feel drained?" he asked, the humor gone from his voice. I nodded. "It's not the only reason, but it's adding to the weight your body is carrying." It was a hard truth to swallow, especially for someone who thought he'd been making smart choices. But Harold wasn't one to wallow. That evening, he and Ellen did a quiet purge of their pantry. Out went the seed crackers, boxed granola bars, and light salad dressings, all of them hiding the same ingredient: Ellen replaced them with glass bottles of extra virgin olive oil, small tins of avocado oil, and jars of roasted chickpeas for snacking. "If I'm going to dress a salad," Harold said with a grin, "it's going to be with something I can actually pronounce." The first week without cottonseed oil was uneventful, but by the second, Harold noticed the change. That heavy fog he'd grown used to in the late mornings started to lift. He was able to move from one task to another without stopping for long breaks. Even Ellen remarked one afternoon, "You're talking faster again, like you used to." He hadn't realized his speech had slowed, but in hindsight, it made sense. Fatigue doesn't just weigh down the body, it slows the rhythm of life itself. One Saturday morning, Ellen suggested they visit the farmer's market, something they hadn't done in months. They wandered through the stalls, tasting fresh goat cheese, picking up bunches of kale, chatting with old acquaintances. At one booth, Harold found himself sampling an herbed vinaigrette made with olive oil and lemon. The taste was so bright, so clean, that he bought 2 bottles without hesitation. "No more mystery oils," he said, handing one to Ellen. By the time they returned home, Harold was animated in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. He unpacked the groceries, arranged the bottles in the pantry, even started a pot of soup for lunch. It was as if removing that one hidden toxin had lifted a veil from his days. Not in a dramatic, movie-style transformation, but in a quiet, steady way, the way real healing often happens. When he came in for his checkup a few weeks later, his blood work showed subtle but meaningful shifts. More stable electrolytes, slightly improved heart rhythm patterns, and a drop in inflammatory markers. But Harold wasn't focused on the numbers. "I just feel lighter," he told me, "like my body's not fighting itself anymore." I reminded him that his journey wasn't about perfection. It was about learning to listen to his body, to the quiet signals it sends, to the foods that nourish rather than drain him. And sometimes listening meant letting go of things he'd never thought to question. In this case, it meant saying goodbye to the oil that had been silently stealing his energy. The changes from cutting out sunflower seeds and hidden oils were undeniable. Harold moved with more ease now, and the heaviness in his legs was fading into memory. But there was still a quiet frustration gnawing at him, a stiffness in his hands when he gardened, a lingering ache in his knees after longer walks. It wasn't the old, crippling fatigue anymore. This was different, a deeper, more stubborn weakness, as if his body was missing something it needed to stay strong. One afternoon, Harold was helping Ellen make dinner. She was preparing a tray of homemade bread rolls, sprinkling the tops with tiny ivory seeds before slipping them into the oven. "I've been using these forever," she said with a smile, holding up the jar. "Your favorite." He recognized them instantly, sesame seeds. They'd been part of his life since childhood, scattered over bread, stirred into stir-fry, ground into the creamy tahini he loved to spread on toast. It never occurred to him that something so small and familiar could be playing a role in his lingering aches. A few days later, Harold mentioned the sesame habit in passing during his appointment. I leaned back, meeting his gaze. "Sesame isn't inherently bad," I told him, "but for someone your age, especially with your current bone density and mineral levels, it can quietly tip the scales in the wrong direction." I explained how sesame seeds are high in compounds called phytates, natural plant chemicals that bind to minerals like calcium, magnesium, and zinc, preventing the body from absorbing them fully. In a younger, stronger digestive system, the effect might be small, but in seniors who are already more prone to deficiencies, the impact can be significant. Harold frowned, thinking back. "So you're saying, every time I eat these, I might be robbing myself of the very minerals I need to keep my bones and joints healthy?" I nodded. "And there's another piece," I added. "Sesame allergies, even mild, hidden ones, are becoming more common in older adults. They don't always show up as dramatic reactions. Sometimes it's just chronic inflammation, joint pain, skin dryness, low energy." It was a lot to take in. For Harold, sesame was more than food. It was a flavor tied to memories. His mother's Sunday bread, the little Chinese restaurant he and Ellen went to on their first date. To think of giving it up felt almost personal. But he also couldn't ignore the possibility that these tiny seeds were quietly undermining his progress. Ellen, ever supportive, suggested an experiment. "Let's cut it out for a few weeks and see what happens. If nothing changes, you can have it back." They cleared the pantry of tahini jars, sesame crackers, and the familiar glass spice jar on the counter. For stir-fries, Ellen swapped sesame oil for avocado oil, and when she baked bread, She left the tops bare or brushed them with a little olive oil and sea salt instead. The first week was uneventful. Harold missed the nutty taste, but he found new textures and flavors creeping into his meals. He started snacking on walnut halves in the afternoon, adding slices of creamy avocado to his toast. By the second week, the changes began to appear. One morning, he noticed his hands didn't feel as stiff while pruning the rose bushes. His knees didn't protest as much after an hour in the garden, and almost surprisingly, the dry patches on his elbows, something he'd ignored for years, began to soften. By the end of the month, Harold felt a quiet but profound shift. His joints moved more fluidly. The ache that had followed him through long walks seemed to have loosened its grip. "It's like I've been carrying a weight I couldn't see," he told me at his follow-up, "and now it's been lifted." His blood work showed slightly improved calcium levels and a better magnesium to calcium balance. Not a miracle cure, but a clear, measurable improvement. I reminded him that sometimes the things that hold us back aren't the obvious culprits. They're the familiar comforts we've never thought to question. For Harold, sesame seeds had been part of his story for as long as he could remember. Letting them go wasn't just about health. It was about being willing to see his habits with fresh eyes, even the ones tied to warm memories. As spring rolled into early summer, Harold noticed another change. He was waking up earlier, without the dragging stiffness that used to keep him in bed. He'd sit at the kitchen table with Ellen, watching the first light pour across the yard, and feel an unfamiliar sense of possibility in the day ahead. Small changes, one seed at a time, were building into something bigger than he'd imagined. By midsummer, Harold felt like a man slowly stepping out from under a heavy cloud. The swelling was gone, the fog in his head had cleared, and even the creak in his knees had eased. He was proud of the changes he and Ellen had made, swapping out sunflower seeds, clearing out the cottonseed oil, and saying goodbye to sesame. But there was one habit he held on to, quietly and stubbornly. Every couple of days, Harold would stir a spoonful of dry chia seeds into his morning cereal or sprinkle them over fruit and yogurt. He'd read countless articles praising them as a superfood, and his daughter had once given him a glossy jar labeled organic raw chia as a gift. They were part of his healthy image, the little thing he did for his heart, his digestion, his longevity, as the magazines called it. One warm Saturday, Harold and Ellen were preparing to head to the farmer's market. Harold, moving a little too quickly, grabbed a spoonful of chia seeds and tipped them straight into his mouth, chasing them with a sip of water. It wasn't something he'd ever thought twice about. But halfway to the market, a strange tightness gripped his throat. He cleared it, coughed, took another sip from his water bottle, but the feeling only grew worse. It was as if something was expanding inside his chest. By the time they reached the market, Harold was short of breath, his voice rasping. Ellen insisted they turn back, and within the hour, they were in my clinic. He looked pale, his breath shallow. I asked him to describe exactly what had happened. As soon as he mentioned the dry chia seeds, my stomach dropped. I'd seen this before. Chia's ability to absorb many times its weight in liquid was well known. In a healthy digestive system, properly soaked chia can be harmless, even beneficial. But swallowed dry, especially for someone with slower digestion and a narrower esophagus, it can turn into a dangerous blockage in minutes. I explained the risk as we monitored him. Chia expands as it absorbs water. You only took a sip after swallowing it, so now it's swelling right where you feel that tightness. If it clumps too much, it can block the passage completely. His eyes widened. "You're telling me I almost choked myself with health food?" I nodded gently. "You're lucky Ellen acted quickly. In some cases, it can require surgery to remove." We kept him under observation for several hours, giving him small sips of warm water to help the chia move downward slowly. Fortunately, it passed without needing any invasive intervention, but the scare was enough. "That's it," Harold said later that evening, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea. "No more dry chia, ever." Over the next few days, we talked about safer alternatives. If he still wanted the omega-3 and fiber benefits, soaked flax seeds could give him similar nutrition without the expansion risk. Or, if he really wanted chia, it would need to be soaked in plenty of water for at least 30 minutes, ideally overnight, before eating. Ellen took no chances. She emptied the jar of dry chia seeds into the compost bin and replaced it with a mason jar of flax, along with a printed recipe for overnight soaked seeds taped to the lid. The change was immediate in more ways than one. Harold not only avoided another choking scare, but also noticed that soaked seeds felt gentler on his stomach. The bloating he sometimes experienced after breakfast disappeared. It's like my gut is calmer, he told me with a small smile. I can actually go about my morning without feeling like I've swallowed a balloon. The incident became a quiet turning point in Harold's journey. It wasn't just about chia seeds anymore, it was about how he approached healthy foods in general. He realized that age changes not only what the body needs, but also how it processes and tolerates even familiar foods. Some, like chia, require a little more respect and preparation than the glossy magazine articles ever mention. One sunny morning, a few weeks later, Harold and Ellen sat outside with their breakfast. His bowl was simple: creamy yogurt, a spoonful of soaked flax, fresh berries, and a drizzle of honey. He ate slowly, savoring the flavors, aware of how much thought now went into what he put into his body. It wasn't about chasing trends anymore, it was about understanding what worked for him, the man he was now, not the man he was 20 years ago. By the time autumn crept into Oregon, Harold had become something of a detective in his own kitchen. Every jar, every bag, every bottle got a second look before it made its way into his meals. He'd learned to ask questions he never would have thought of a year ago. Which oils were used? Were there hidden additives? Could even a healthy ingredient be quietly working against him? It was during one of these quiet pantry inspections that Ellen held up a small paper bag from a local Asian market. Inside were tiny, unassuming seeds the color of midnight. "Black sesame," she said with a little smile. "The lady at the shop told me they're different from the regular kind. Said they're good for, what was it, the brain?" Harold raised an eyebrow. "We've been through the sesame talk, remember?" He was wary, but I assured him when they came in for his next appointment that black sesame seeds were not the same as the hulled, toasted white sesame he had given up months earlier. These were whole, unrefined, their mineral-rich shells still intact. And in traditional medicine, they'd been used for centuries in small amounts to support memory, circulation, and overall vitality. I told him about a recent study showing older adults who consumed a spoonful or two of ground black sesame daily had not only improved blood pressure, but also sharper recall. "It's not magic," I said, "but it can help. Think of it as giving your brain and your blood vessels a little extra protection." Harold's skepticism softened. After all, he'd seen how removing the wrong seeds could change his health. Maybe adding the right ones could take him even further. Ellen took the lead in preparation. She lightly toasted a small batch each week, grinding them into a fine powder and storing it in a jar on the counter. Each morning, she stirred a teaspoon into warm water with a drizzle of honey, setting it beside Harold's coffee. At first, he barely noticed a difference, but within 2 weeks, subtle changes began to emerge. One morning, while chatting with a neighbor he hadn't seen in years, Harold found himself recalling her grown children's names without hesitation. Another afternoon, he picked up a crossword puzzle he'd abandoned months earlier and breezed through half of it in one sitting. Ellen noticed it too, the way he seemed more engaged in conversations, how he no longer paused mid-story to fumble for a word. The improvements weren't only in his mind. His blood pressure, which had hovered just above the safe range for years, began to nudge downward. On their daily walks, Harold felt lighter, less winded on the small hill near the park. "I don't know if it's the seeds or everything together," he admitted to me at his checkup, "but I feel more awake." I reminded him it was never just one thing. Health, especially at his age, was a mosaic, each small, thoughtful change adding to the whole picture. The black sesame was simply another piece, a gentle nudge toward balance. And it came with an unexpected gift. It gave Harold something to look forward to each morning, a quiet ritual that marked the start of his day with intention. By late October, the change in Harold's demeanor was clear to anyone who knew him. His neighbors commented on how animated he seemed, how quick he was to stop for a chat. At the community center, he joined a small group that met weekly for trivia games, something he'd avoided before, worried he'd feel slow or out of step. Instead, he found himself laughing, contributing answers, and enjoying the mental challenge. One evening after dinner, Harold stood by the kitchen counter as Ellen prepared the next morning's breakfast jars. He reached for the black sesame container and, with a grin, said, "These might be my new favorite seeds." Ellen looked up and laughed. "Careful," she teased. "Next thing you know, you'll be giving pantry tours to the neighbors." It was a light-hearted moment, but Harold knew it meant something deeper. These little black seeds weren't just another health food. They were proof that change didn't have to be about loss. Sometimes it was about finding something new that gave more than it took. By November, the kitchen had become Harold's quiet laboratory. Every small jar on the counter seemed to tell a story, one of trial, error, and quiet victories. There was the jar of pumpkin seeds Ellen roasted each week, the dark powder of ground black sesame, and now a new glass container sat beside them filled with tiny golden brown flecks. Ellen had picked them up during a grocery run, holding the bag in her hand like she'd found treasure. "Flax seeds," she announced when she came through the door. "Whole ones. The lady at the co-op said they're good for your heart and digestion." Harold peered at them skeptically. They looked like bird food, but when they came into my clinic the following week, I told him she was onto something. Flax seeds, I explained, were rich in plant-based omega-3s and lignans, compounds that could help calm inflammation and support healthy blood pressure. But the real gift was their gentle effect on digestion. Ground flax could absorb water in the gut, softening stool and making bowel movements easier. A quiet, natural help for seniors whose digestive rhythms often slowed with age. "The trick," I cautioned, "is to grind them fresh. Whole seeds will just pass right through you." Ellen wasted no time. She bought a small coffee grinder just for flax, whirring a spoonful each morning and sprinkling it into Harold's oatmeal or blending it into his smoothie. At first, Harold didn't think much of it, but within a week, he noticed something almost surprising in its simplicity. He felt comfortable. The stubborn bloating that sometimes followed breakfast was gone. His trips to the bathroom were easier, less of an ordeal, and there was a new steadiness to his mornings, as though his body was quietly working with him instead of against him. One evening, after a long day helping a neighbor repair a fence, Harold realized something else. His legs, though tired, didn't feel weighed down the way they used to. There was no lingering heaviness in his calves, no tightness in his chest. When he mentioned it at his next checkup, I explained that flax's omega-3 content could help keep blood vessels flexible, improving circulation. "It's not a miracle," I told him, "but it's the kind of daily choice that adds up. You won't feel it in a single day, you'll feel it over time, in the ease of your steps, in the calm of your heart." Harold took the advice to heart, quite literally. He began treating flax like a daily medicine, one that didn't come in a pill bottle, but in the small, familiar hum of the grinder on the kitchen counter. He experimented, stirring it into yogurt, sprinkling it over vegetable soup, even mixing it into the dough for homemade bread. "It's the only seed that works in everything," he told Ellen one morning as he stood at the stove flipping oat pancakes dusted with flax. The benefits began showing in subtle, everyday moments. On cold mornings, Harold no longer felt the same stiffness in his joints as he reached for his jacket. Afternoon walks, once a slow shuffle, had turned into a steady stride, and perhaps most telling, his blood pressure readings had begun to dip, enough that even the pharmacist at the local drugstore noticed when he stopped by to check it. "Whatever you're doing," she said, smiling, "keep it up." Ellen noticed changes too. She saw it in the way Harold seemed to wake with more energy, how he hummed softly while making breakfast, how he was quick to suggest little outings, a drive to the coast, a visit to the bookshop, a walk down by the river. These weren't grand gestures, but they were signs of a man quietly reclaiming the rhythms he thought he'd lost. One Saturday afternoon, they hosted a small lunch for their daughter and grandson. Harold served a big salad topped with roasted pumpkin seeds and a loaf of homemade bread studded with ground flax. As they sat at the table, sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, Harold found himself telling the story of his seed journey. How one by one, he'd let go of the ones that hurt him and welcomed in those that healed. His grandson, barely 12, listened wide-eyed. "Grandpa," he said between bites, "I think you're like a food detective." Harold laughed, glancing at Ellen. "Maybe I am, but the case isn't closed yet." Because deep down, he knew there was still one more seed to find. One that could complete the picture, not just for his heart and joints, but for his overall strength and vitality. And that discovery, he sensed, might just be the most important of all. The first frost of winter had settled over Oregon, frosting the grass and turning the mornings crisp and bright. Harold pulled on his coat and scarf, stepped outside, and was met by the sharp bite of cold air in his lungs. A year ago, this kind of morning would have made him retreat to the warmth of the living room, but now he found himself smiling as he walked down the driveway, his breath clouding in front of him. It wasn't just that the swelling and stiffness were gone, it was the new ease in his stride, the quiet confidence in his body again. He'd been through so many small changes over the past months that each improvement felt like another layer of himself coming back. But there was still one thing that had been quietly bothering him. the occasional ache deep in his knees and hips after longer walks, a soreness that reminded him his journey wasn't over yet. It was Ellen who stumbled onto the next piece of the puzzle. She'd been reading an article about anti-inflammatory foods for seniors and pointed to a picture of soft, pale green seeds scattered over a salad. "Hemp seeds," she said. "They say they're good for joints and muscles, and they don't even need soaking." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Hemp? Like," she laughed. "No, not that kind. These don't have anything to do with getting high, just pure nutrition." When they visited me a week later, Ellen brought the article with her. I confirmed what she'd read. Hemp seeds had one of the most balanced ratios of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids in any whole food. Exactly what Harold needed after we'd spent months working to reduce his omega-6 overload. They also contained gamma-linolenic acid, a rare compound that could help regulate inflammation and hormone function. "Think of them as joint food," I told him, "but also brain food, heart food, even energy food. And they're soft enough that you can eat them as they are." Harold was curious but cautious. He'd learned by now that it wasn't about jumping on every new health trend, but about listening to what his body needed. So he started small, 1 spoonful sprinkled over his morning oatmeal. The seeds had a mild, nutty flavor that blended easily with whatever he ate. Within a week, Ellen was slipping them into everything: salads, soups, even his evening yogurt with berries. The first change Harold noticed wasn't in his joints, but in his mornings. The sluggishness that sometimes lingered after waking was gone. He felt more alert, more ready to move. His energy held steady through the day instead of dipping in the early afternoon. And by the 3rd week, he realized something else. The deep ache in his knees after long walks had eased. He could climb the small hill near the park without pausing halfway to catch his breath. Ellen noticed too. "You don't groan when you sit down anymore," she teased one evening. Harold chuckled. "Guess I don't need to make sound effects to prove I'm alive." But inside, he felt quietly proud. It wasn't just about being able to walk farther or bend more easily. It was about feeling capable again, the way he used to feel when he was younger and didn't think twice about lifting a box, kneeling in the garden, or taking the long way home just for the pleasure of the walk. When he came in for his next checkup, the improvements showed up in his labs as well. His inflammation markers had dropped significantly, and his good cholesterol, the HDL, had gone up. His grip strength, something we measured each visit, was stronger than it had been in years. "You're rebuilding yourself, Harold," I told him, "one seed at a time." That night, Harold and Ellen celebrated in their own quiet way. They made a simple dinner: roasted vegetables, a piece of salmon, and a salad generously sprinkled with hemp seeds. They sat at the table, candles flickering, and talked about the past year. "Funny," Harold said, "I thought getting older meant slowly giving things up, but this year I've gained more than I've lost." Ellen reached across the table and took his hand. "Maybe it's because you stopped eating like you were 40, she said with a grin. As the year wound down, Harold looked ahead to spring. For the first time in years, he was already making plans: longer walks, a small vegetable garden, maybe even a weekend trip to the coast. He felt ready for it all: the seeds, the small changes, the patience. They had given him more than health. They had given him back his sense of possibility. By the time the new year rolled around, Harold's kitchen felt less like a place where meals were simply made and more like the center of his renewal. The jars of seeds on the counter told the story of his past year, a quiet revolution of small choices that had added up to something far greater than he could have imagined. Sunflower seeds, cottonseed oil, sesame, and dry chia, all gone. In their place were the black sesame, flax, pumpkin, and hemp seeds that had quietly stitched strength back into his days. On a frosty January morning, Harold stood by the window, cradling a mug of tea. Outside, the sky was the color of pearl, and the world seemed to move at half speed. Ellen was still asleep, the house hushed except for the low hum of the fridge. He thought about the man he had been just a year ago, the stiffness in his joints, the swelling in his ankles, the afternoon fatigue that weighed him down like a heavy coat. Back then, he had told himself it was simply the price of aging. But now, looking at the reflection in the glass, he saw a different man. His cheeks had more color, his steps were quicker, his posture straighter, and perhaps most importantly, he no longer woke each day expecting to feel worse than the one before. There was a steadiness in his body now, like the slow, quiet return of spring after a long winter. Later that morning, as Ellen bustled into the kitchen, she found Harold grinding flax seeds for their breakfast. "Never thought I'd see the day you became the seed man," she teased, leaning against the counter. He laughed, shaking his head. "I never thought seeds would teach me more about myself than history ever did." Over breakfast, they talked about the changes they'd made, not just in food, but in the way they approached their days. No more rushing meals, no more ignoring the small warnings the body sends. They had learned to listen together. Sometimes it was Ellen catching a subtle change in his mood or energy. Other times it was Harold paying closer attention to how certain meals left him feeling hours later. It wasn't about rules anymore, it was about a kind of conversation between them, their food, and the years they had lived. One afternoon, Harold visited the community center for the first time in months. He walked into the cafe area and was greeted with warmth by friends who hadn't seen him in a while. "You look different," one of them said, tilting her head. "You've got a bit of spring in your step." Harold smiled. "Must be the seeds," he said with a wink. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The seeds had been the beginning, but what they really gave him was momentum. Each improvement had encouraged the next. A little more energy meant longer walks meant better sleep meant clearer mornings. It was a chain reaction, and the longer it went on, the stronger it became. He no longer thought in terms of fixing himself. Instead, he thought about how to keep building on what he'd gained. One quiet evening, Harold found himself flipping through an old notebook where he'd once jotted down doctor's notes and test results. The early pages told the story of a man stuck in slow decline, watching the numbers shift in the wrong direction. But the later pages were different. Steady improvements in blood pressure, inflammation markers dropping, cholesterol balancing. He ran his finger down the columns, remembering how each change had felt in his body, each new seed a turning point. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with Ellen, the two of them eating warm bread studded with ground flax and pumpkin seeds. "You know," he said softly, "I think I've been looking at aging the wrong way. I thought it was about holding on to what you had for as long as possible. But maybe it's about building something new, even now, especially now." Ellen reached across the table, her eyes warm. "And look how far you've built already." Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches, but inside, Harold felt something steady and alive taking root. The year ahead stretched before him like a blank page, and for the first time in a long time, he was eager to see how the story would unfold. February arrived with its cold, damp mornings, and Harold had settled into a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. His days felt full again, not busy in the frantic way they had when he was younger, but full in the sense that each hour carried something worth noticing. The scent of coffee in the morning, the warm weight of Ellen's hand during their walks, the quiet satisfaction of grinding flax while the sun crept over the horizon. One Friday afternoon, Harold was sitting at the local community center with a group of friends he hadn't seen in a while. The conversation drifted from grandkids to gardening to the aches and complaints that had become a familiar soundtrack in their gatherings. One friend, Robert, rubbed his knee and said, "Doc says it's arthritis. Guess it's downhill from here." Harold shook his head slowly. "I thought the same thing last year," he said, leaning forward. "But I learned something. Sometimes it's not the years, it's the habits." Curiosity sparked in the group. They leaned in as Harold told his story, how he'd gone from swelling ankles and sluggish mornings to walking farther and feeling stronger than he had in years. He didn't make it sound like a miracle. Instead, he described it the way it had happened, one small change at a time, starting with the seeds he'd eaten without thinking. He told them about tossing out sunflower seeds, checking labels for cottonseed oil, letting go of sesame, learning the hard way about dry chia, and then the good ones, black sesame, flax, pumpkin, hemp, each with its own part in his recovery. Robert frowned. "You're telling me seeds made that much difference?" Harold smiled. "Not just seeds, awareness, but yes, these tiny things changed my days." That conversation didn't end at the table. Over the next few weeks, a few of Harold's friends started asking for specifics. What kind of pumpkin seeds? How do you prepare black sesame? Do you grind the flax every time? Harold found himself jotting notes, printing out small recipe cards Ellen helped design on the home computer. Before long, he had a little folder of seed swaps and simple breakfast ideas. One Saturday, Robert showed up at Harold's door holding a bag of pumpkin seeds. "I'm trying it," he said with a sheepish grin. Another friend called to say she'd switched from sunflower to hemp seeds in her morning smoothie and felt less stiff climbing the stairs. These little ripples felt good, not because Harold wanted credit, but because he knew what it meant to feel like you had some control again, to find out that not every ache and loss was inevitable. The ripple reached closer to home, too. Their daughter Anna came by one evening with a notebook in hand. "Dad," she said, "I've been reading about what you've been doing. Do you think it could help me feel less tired after work?" She was only in her 40s, but Harold saw himself in her. The slow creep of fatigue, the shrug that said, "That's just how it is." He handed her a small jar of hemp seeds and a bag of flax. "Start here," he said. Harold realized something else during these conversations. Telling his story out loud made him see it more clearly. The changes hadn't just been about nutrition, they'd reshaped the way he thought about himself. He wasn't someone who was slowing down with age anymore. He was someone learning, adapting, and yes, even improving. That shift in identity was as powerful as any food he'd eaten. One Sunday morning, Ellen suggested they host a casual brunch for a few friends from the community center. The table was simple: warm bread studded with flax and pumpkin seeds, a salad with hemp seeds sprinkled over the greens, a small dish of honey-sweetened black sesame paste. Harold poured coffee, told a few stories, and watched as his friends tried each dish. There was laughter, a few raised eyebrows, even a joke or two about joining Harold's seed cult. But beneath the humor was something real, a shared curiosity, a sense that maybe they didn't have to accept every part of aging as unchangeable. As the guests left, Robert clapped Harold on the shoulder. "I think you're onto something," he said quietly, "and I think you should keep talking about it." That night, Harold and Ellen sat by the window, the dishes stacked in the sink, the house still carrying the faint smell of warm bread. Harold thought about what Robert had said. Maybe sharing his story wasn't just about helping others, maybe it was also part of his own healing. Because every time he told it, he remembered that the man he was a year ago, tired, stiff, resigned, wasn't coming back. And that, Harold thought, was the best part of all. March arrived with a softness in the air, the kind that hints at spring even when frost still clings to the edges of the morning. Harold found himself out on the porch one early Saturday, cradling a mug of tea and watching a pair of robins hop across the lawn. He'd always liked this time of year, the quiet turning point when the world begins to wake up. But this year, it felt different. It wasn't just the season that was changing, it was him. A year ago, Harold's world had felt smaller, narrowed down to the safe paths he knew he could manage. Long walks had become short strolls, errands were measured by how much energy they would cost. And each day carried a quiet calculation. How much can I do before my body pushes back? But now, as he looked out at the slow, patient light creeping over the grass, he realized he hadn't asked himself that question in weeks. The changes hadn't come in a rush. They'd been stitched into his life slowly, like a quilt. Each patch a small choice, each seam a habit he'd held onto. Swapping out sunflower seeds for pumpkin, saying goodbye to sesame, learning to soak flax and grind it fresh, discovering hemp seeds and black sesame like treasures hidden in plain sight. These weren't grand gestures, but they had worked together in a way he never could have predicted. One afternoon, Harold stopped by the clinic for a routine checkup. I greeted him with a smile. "You look taller," I teased. He laughed, but there was truth in it. His posture was straighter, his handshake stronger, and even his voice seemed to carry more weight. His blood pressure had settled into a healthier range, his inflammation markers were lower, and he had gained a bit of lean muscle without even trying. As we talked, Harold admitted something that had been on his mind. "It's strange," he said, "but I feel like I've been given back time I didn't think I had, and now I'm wondering what to do with it." I told him the same thing I tell many of my patients. When your body starts giving you back energy, it's a gift. Spend it on the things that matter most. That thought stayed with Harold. In the days that followed, he began looking at his calendar differently. The blank spaces no longer felt like empty hours to fill, but like opportunities. He and Ellen started taking short day trips again, a drive to the coast for clam chowder, a walk through the botanical gardens, a visit to a used bookstore 2 towns over. These outings weren't about exercise or proving anything. They were about living in the small, bright moments that health makes possible. One evening, while Ellen was in the kitchen, Harold sat at the dining table with a notepad. He began jotting down the lessons the past year had taught him, not in medical terms, but in the language of everyday life. He wrote about how easy it was to overlook the quiet damage certain foods could do, how change could start with something as small as a seed, how the act of caring for yourself, meal after meal, could slowly rewrite the story you tell about who you are. The list wasn't just for him. He thought about Robert at the community center, his daughter Anna, the neighbors who had asked about his seed routine. Maybe he could put it all together, a small guide, a collection of notes and recipes. Nothing fancy, just something to pass along. When he mentioned the idea to Ellen, she smiled. "I think you should," she said. "Not everyone gets a second win like you have, and not everyone knows it's even possible." That night, Harold sat with the thought. The past year hadn't been about chasing youth or trying to be the man he was at 40. It had been about learning to work with the man he was now, to understand his body's language, to give it what it needed, and to stop giving it what wore it down. The seeds were the beginning, but the real change had been in his mindset. As he turned off the kitchen light and headed for bed, Harold paused at the counter, running his hand over the row of jars. The black sesame, the flax, the pumpkin, the hemp, each one a reminder of the days when change had seemed impossible, and the quiet proof that it wasn't. Tomorrow, he thought, he would start writing. Not just for himself, but for anyone who still believed that growing older meant only growing weaker. When Harold first began this journey, he was a man quietly shrinking his world to fit the limits of his body. Swollen ankles kept him from his morning walks. Fatigue weighed down his afternoons. Meals he believed were healthy were quietly draining his strength. But change began with one small decision, to question what he'd always taken for granted. One seed at a time, Harold rebuilt himself. Letting go of sunflower seeds eased his inflammation. Swapping out hidden cottonseed oil lifted the fog from his mornings. Saying goodbye to sesame helped his joints and skin heal. Learning the truth about dry chia kept him safe. And embracing black sesame, flax, pumpkin, and hemp gave him back not only energy but confidence. He now walks farther, stands taller, and greets each day with the steadiness he thought he had lost for good. But Harold's story is about more than seeds. It's about listening to your body, to the quiet clues it offers, to the possibility that life can feel different tomorrow than it does today. Change doesn't have to come in leaps. It can come in teaspoons, in the gentle rhythm of new habits, repeated day after day. So take a moment to look at your own routines. What small choices could you change? What quiet harms could you let go of? And what nourishing habits could you welcome in? The answer might be smaller and more powerful than you think. Because as Harold learned, getting older doesn't have to mean giving up. It can mean growing stronger, wiser, and more alive than you've felt in years. And maybe, like him, you'll discover that the best seasons of life are still ahead.